person sitting alone in a corner of a room, quietly. But that's only one way to suffer. That's only a visible way. How often in the news do you hear them talk about a celebrity who was so happy? He brought joy to everybody. And yet was still suffering, and we didn't know about it until it was too late. And part of this, and what society does teach us and what we're learning from this, is that we're taught this idea of silent suffering. You know, how so often do they say they seem so happy because they chose to suffer in this way, or they were taught to suffer in this way, that this was how it's acceptable. Oh, no, you're fine. A lot of the modern world and the Western society has placed this stigma on suffering. And this nobility as well. We need to look no further than right here in our own neighborhoods to see this stigma. Substance abuse disorder sufferers are victims of this. As are those who suffer from mental health disorders. Not only are we taught in society at large that it is a moral failing of the individual to be sick with these disorders, but we're taught it's their problem and they should fix it themselves. That's what society has to say about these issues. This stance makes three things readily observable for how we are told a person should suffer. One, that they are lesser for suffering, that suffering is, that they need to just stop suffering, because obviously it's something that is readily fixable. And three, it's up to them to fix it. Or two, it's up to them to fix it. They're the ones using drugs. Why should I care about their suffering? As a social worker, I hear that almost every day when facing the opioid epidemic, and it breaks my heart. Now, this is also seen in the way we approach mental and emotional anguish. How often have you heard, can't you just not think about it? Or, why can't you just be happy? You're bringing down everybody else. Don't be such a crybaby. Toughen up. How often do we say that to small children? I know whenever I grew up playing football in southern West Virginia, if I got hit, it was toughen up or walk it off. No, how are you? Are you okay? Even with moral anguish, because we can suffer morally, it was your decision. You can't just not do it, right? And here, we have spiritual anguish. How often have you heard we all have our crosses to bear? You reap what you sow. And then even with physical anguish, you should have taken better care of yourself. Society teaches us to approach anguish and suffering as it is a problem of the person who is suffering and it is their problem to fix it and nothing else. We even idolize some types of silent suffering as much as we stigmatize it. We all have this idea that suffering can make you great if you can overcome it. Van Gogh, Kurt Cobain, Sylvia Plath, O'Keeffe. We say, look what happens when you can suffer alone. If you don't tell people about your suffering, you can overcome it and you can paint the starry night from the window at your hospital. But ask anyone who has ever suffered if they would rather be happy or paint the night sky from a locked room with bars on its windows. And they will tell you they will take happy every time. And that's just society. Moving on to religions. As mentioned, religions have this tendency to also place great propriety on suffering alone and in silence. We idolize martyrs who died for the cause. As a matter of fact, in the Abrahamic religions, there are 23 Judaic prophets who died as martyrs, 15 people connected directly to Muhammad who are venerated as martyrs, and in Christianity, there are more than we have time to talk about today. We talk about Christ like when it comes to suffering, that's how we get the phrase, we all have our own cross to bear. This idea that he also suffered alone, and that's the way we should too when it comes to Christianity. And it makes this funny paradox, because oftentimes the same religions take this moralist approach. where it's again on the person who morally felt that they should have to suffer. It has this odd paradox, the idea of you sinning and you having to fix it, despite it being against the very religion's ideals. And this isn't just Christianity, it's taught in Judaism and Islam, and in some Buddhism, that one should suffer alone. But is that what they really say? A lot of this is taken from the very foundation of the modern Western psyche. Almost all schools of Western thought are based off of what's called individualism, which is the moral stance, political philosophy, ideology, or social outlook that emphasizes the moral worth of the individual. Individualists promote the exercise of one's goals and desires, and so value independence and self-reliance, and advocates the interest of the individual should achieve precedence over that of the state or a social group, while opposing external interference upon one's own interest by society. It is this idea that the only thing important is you and you alone. And so they reject interference that includes with how they suffer. On top of this, from that individualism often comes what's called moralism. And it's a way of judging other people by morality standards. That goes back to they were asking for it. Or they're the ones who chose to do it, so they should be the ones who have to suffer and fix it. It's seen a lot, especially in some branches of Christianity, in which they want to disassociate themselves from certain sinners. That is moralism. And that is something else that we find this basis for in Western philosophy. These come from the same people who invented concepts such as the soul that many people utilize in their religions. And so there we see that how we're taught to suffer is built in from the very basis of how we live. So if this is how we are taught, what do we do to relearn it? How do we fix it? Because we know it's not working. What if we misinterpreted what those religions say and tell us how to suffer? What if science and philosophy has suggested another way, one that lessens the suffering of ourselves? What if there's a better way to suffer, and that way is to suffer openly and to ask for help, and to suffer together instead of alone? How do we relearn and ingrain something new and build upon it? It's simple. We ask for help. Studies have shown group therapy and support groups by and large have been proved to be more effective, and even more effective with one-on-one therapy. They increase the effectiveness of it. Almost all medically assisted treatment for those who abuse drugs in our area require you join AA or NA or have some group therapy along with it because it's so effective. Sexual assault victims and people suffering from PTSD have more positive outcomes if they join support groups and attend group therapy. This is backed by professional peer-reviewed science that there is a better way. So we know for a fact there is a better way. There have even been papers published to show physical pain lessens when you are in contact with a loved one. It releases oxytocin into you to lessen that pain. We are built not to suffer alone from our very biological standard. And this can even be applied to moral instances. So, what guides do we have if we have to throw the old ones out? If we can't rely on that individualism anymore? Well, we still have those religions. We just have to look at them differently. Because what we are taught is not what they say. There's a theological movement called narrative theology, and its sole practice is to re-examine religions and their texts the way we do books for English class. Like they're written by old dead Russians, we look for motifs, we look for overarching themes and developments instead of at a single surah or verse. if you do this, and take a second to do it, if you know about Christianity, think about the overarching story of the Bible. If you're Hindu, the overarching story of your religious text, and so on. Just take a quick moment. And even if you're not, choose the one you know the most about. The overarching story is very different from a single verse. I grew up as a Christian, and so that's what my basis is for this one. Is when you do it this way, the Bible no longer becomes about one man suffering for the sins of everybody. You realize he gathered 12 people around him because suffering alone is so hard. In the Quran, Muhammad called his companions around him. And even in Judaism, the Israelites, when they proved to have unrighteous among them, and God banished them to the wilderness, he did so as a group because he understood you're not supposed to suffer alone. And on top of that, with the companions, jihad translates to the great struggle. He called those companions because it is such a great struggle. Even in other religions, ones that I'm less versed on, in Vietnamese Buddhism, you need a Sangha to truly practice, which is a group of 4 or more. We have been having Scott come out to do some Zen Buddhism classes, and he was asked, can we, just video it, do it over webcam, stream it. And he said it's not the same, you have to be there. He talked about sitting across from another person, even in silence, can help. So, I don't think there is a religion that truly asks us to suffer alone once we get down into it. It's the people who are asking us to suffer alone because it's hard to take on somebody else's suffering. To share the burden and lessen it for the person next to you. But they also show you that you are no less for it because everyone from Christ to Abada Vista to Muhammad to Moses suffered, and they chose not to do it alone. But what about culturally? So we've talked about the religious aspect. Culturally, this is already happening and we are seeing the shift. Especially lately, I know we've all heard of the Me Too movement. We've all seen the power a group can muster to say you are not alone in the pain you face in this world. And with this behind you and to help you through it, you will come out across the other side. We've seen it make a woman strong enough to stand up in a room full of conservative white males after receiving death threats and somehow find the strength in front of and for not just thousands, but millions of people to say, I suffered and no one should have to go through that. There's the Women's March who's doing it. The resistance is doing it. We're starting to see the shift in how we view suffering and who we see as capable of suffering. We are starting to see its universality and realizing in the savage world, we do not have to go it alone. Now, what would this look like in practice among us? Because that's the hard part. It's easy to say it, but it's hard to do it, to suffer out loud after we've been taught to suffer in silence for so long. To suffer alone, to suffer together instead of alone. So, I personally think that that's what's kept us from doing it for so long. Is that we're so used to carrying our own burden, we don't think we can carry another person's even for a moment. But how easy is it? How easy is it to turn to the person next to you and simply ask, how are you? Real. Or, what can I do for you today instead of just hello? How can I lessen your suffering today? Should be our new greeting to one another. I'll tell you what it would look like if we could do this. It would look like a world with a lot less people dying from overdoses. As the leading reason for not getting treatment for people who suffer substance abuse disorder is they feel like they're being stigmatized and will be judged for reaching out and giving help. talk to anyone who has gone to a rehabilitation facility, they'll tell you that recovery is a lifelong process. But they'll talk about it openly because something's finally changed to realize that they are suffering together. In the mental health field, there's a movement called End the Stigma, so that people with anxiety, depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia can say, hey, I suffer, you may not see it on me, but I suffer. So if we can get rid of that and get to the point where they can say that to anybody, it's going to make their day easier. And there's also going to be a lot less deaths. There's a recent study out in which the most effective way to stop suicides is to simply ask someone, are you okay? That's all it takes. That's the only effective way. It's been proven statistically more useful than almost any other thing, is to simply say, what can I do for you today? And it would be such a far step from where it is now. I know I talked about the stigma earlier, but suicide specifically, it used to be an actual crime to kill yourself. That's why we say you commit it instead of you die by it. So it starts here on how we change suffering. And even moral. Again, I keep coming back to that. But how hard is it to truly change something morally? Because it's built into our habits and it's what we're taught. Even this, the very basic, this is hard to do because it's ingrained to us as a moral decision that you live your own life. But how hard is it if after Halloween and you keep getting into that candy bowl, to turn to the other person in your house and say, please take that away? Or if you see me reaching in there, call me out on it. It's every aspect that learning to suffer together and allowed and not alone is changed. Because we suffer. All of us do in these ways. And another thing that might just change goes back to the shooting. What would it look like if someone turned to the mass shooter and said, are you okay today? Because most of them have found to have mental health issues in their past. To simply say, what can I do for you? What will end your suffering? How are you? And what would it look like for the people grieving afterwards? To actually ask. Because so often they want to put on that strong face for all the other people suffering as well. To ask, how are you? Reaching out to those grieving, it shows a quicker return to normalcy. And it's just they develop better resilience. That this may not be the end of that this may be the end of your relationship with one person, but it connects you to 7 billion other people on this planet. It would be a world where our first instinct isn't to come at someone as lesser for suffering, but to come to them as equals. To come as another sufferer. And we might see a world where we still get a starry night, but without the bars on the windows. Where we might see the next day painted as well. Where we're still seeing Plath publish poems, where Kurt Cobain got to raise his daughter and be a rock star. Because we know starry nights still exist. With help. So reaching out and asking for help, and reaching out and offering help without being asked, that is what we have to do to relearn how to suffer. Not just when it's too much for ourselves do we need to reach out, or when we think someone else is suffering, but in every moment. There should not be helpers and the helpless in this world. There should just be those of us suffering together. So when you go out here today, I'm going to ask you as a fellow sufferer to suffer in the open with me. I'm going to ask you when you go out those doors today to ask those who suffer, especially in this day and age, like the African American community, those in the Jewish community, how can we lessen your suffering? But I'm also going to ask you to reach out to your neighbor. For those of you who go out to eat afterwards, ask your waiter. Ask the people you're sitting beside right now, ask me, what can I do for you today? And how can we lessen your suffering? Because it's only by admitting it and working together that we can tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. So what can I do to lessen your suffering?